welcome into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Tommy Brzee. As always, it is Tuesday, June 4th, and we have a great show for you today. First, we're going to start talking a little bit about all the changes that are going on around college football and how this might be the time that we remember in about 20 years about just how much it defined this sport that we all love. Then we'll get into a little bit of the College Football Hall of Fame list. Some of the new people that are up for the Hall of Fame have been released, and there's two guys in there that I'm pretty certain are going to make that list. And then we'll get into my all-transfer team on the offensive side of the ball. Definitely a ton of transfers to go through. A really, really good group this year, and we'll definitely break down who I think are the best of the bunch. Then we'll get into the group of 5 playoff contenders. Tons of people that can definitely make a run in the playoff, but there are a couple in particular that I want to highlight today. And then we'll finish it off with a Top 10 Tuesday and talk about the best games of 2024. There are incredible amounts of really, really good games. So it was a little bit hard to make that list, but I feel like I have a pretty good 10. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, get to know each other a little bit, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for all of us. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, because this has been a very, very weird time in college football. I think we can all agree on that. The past couple of years have been really weird with conference realignment, NIL, and transfer portal, and everything in between. There's been a lot of change, and college football has been under a lot of a microscope, I suppose, and a lot of new people are coming in on the party, and some people that we don't necessarily want in on the party. But I think we've all gotten to a spot that we all kind of knew was happening. I think a lot of us were scared of it happening, but it felt like we were heading that way the second that NIL and transfer portal were introduced to this sport, which is essentially the sport is about to be reinvented, and not necessarily at the grassroots part of it where we're still going to have the traditions. We're still going to have the chants. The Saturday in that stadium is still going to be the Saturday in that stadium. It's still going to have that same atmosphere, but a lot of the stuff around the sport is going to be changing drastically. And with that, a lot of the stuff that we love about the sport is going to change. And that's just kind of the way of things. So we're going to have to kind of figure out where we go from here. And obviously, I wish that some of the fans had a little bit bigger say on where we go from here. But that's something we'll kind of dive into. So first, let's get into just kind of what's at stake, why there's so many different things that are going to be changing over the next couple of months, really, and how it can kind of impact the future. So the biggest thing is there's a huge opening for leadership in this sport. No one really knows where the answers are coming from in general for all of the problems that we're facing today. I think one thing that has happened over the last couple of years, if anything has happened to this sport, is the NCAA has lost a lot of power over conferences, over individuals in particular. Greg Sankey is none too happy with them right now. So there are a lot of people in this sport that don't necessarily trust the NCAA or don't necessarily think they have the teeth that they had, a decade ago or even 5 years ago. So that leaves kind of a vacuum, right? That leaves an opening for someone to step up to the plate, and that is a very precarious situation, especially when you're in this point where college football is in particular, because I think we all understand when there is disorder, when there's dysfunction, when there's turmoil, there's a opening, I suppose, to make a lot of money, and that's something that is going to be coming down the road here pretty soon in college football. What form that takes, I'm not exactly sure. I think there's a number of different routes that people will go down. We talked about private equity and how that is a very dangerous proposition for college sports and something that they do not want to get involved in, at least from my point of view, but maybe they might have to. So it feels like there's this big opening for someone to step up to the plate and give an answer for some of the problems that we're facing. Now we have to be careful about who that person is. The sport is under a lot of scrutiny, a lot of microscopes, a lot of people are looking at it that haven't before, frankly, and it's because they don't much care about the sport. They don't much care about really the players in a lot of different ways. And we, I guess not necessarily we technically, but a lot of people in this sport are going to have to decipher who's who. And it's going to be a very, very hard thing to do, and it's going to be something that is going to be defining for the sport going forward, because there's going to be a lot of people that don't have the right intentions that want to get on the sport to make a quick buck. There's also going to be people that want to save college athletics and do right by the student athletes and do the things that we need to be done. And we'll have to figure out who those people are. So it'll be fascinating to kind of watch that. I think one of the bigger things with this House settlement and all of the confusion around it is, how is this money going to be split up? There's $20 million around pretty much every college. You can go under $20 million, which is likely what a lot of colleges will do, because they're not necessarily sitting on piles of cash over at most universities out there. So it sounds like the $20 million being split is a big time topic of conversation. I know the Big 12 is kicking around ideas that we'll absolutely get into throughout this week. I'm sure the SEC, the Big 10, and the ACC are doing the exact same right now. The question is, what does that look like? And it's not necessarily only a question for college football, it's a question for all college sports, but let's just focus on college football for right this second, because it'll be fascinating to see how it impacts college football. I think a lot of this, when you keep collectives in on the party, when you possibly have them in the conversation for years to come, I don't necessarily think you have to go drastically in one direction, drastically to football, and give 10 million of the 20 million to all football players. I think you can distribute it more evenly, but that being said, you also want to keep that competitive advantage. So it's going to be fascinating to watch that unfold. That will be a huge defining moment, not only for college football, but probably more importantly for other college sports around some maybe smaller schools that don't have that 20 million to just throw around willy-nilly. And then we have roster and scholarship counts that are going to be fascinating to watch. If there is a roster cap put in place for college football, the idea has been put around for 85 kids, which is the scholarship number right now, or 100 kids. So if that does happen, it'll change the nature of the sport. There's no two ways about that. There will be no walk-ons essentially across this entire sport. Everyone will be on scholarship, and there will be less roster positions at the Georgias and the Bamas and the Texas of the world. And there will be more at the South Floridas and maybe the Troys and maybe the App States of the world. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. I think it's one of those things that I fully understand why coaches are upset about that. They don't necessarily want to lose that practice squad, that scout team that they love so much and helps them prepare for so many different games. But the reality is, you got to help out some smaller schools where you can. I think that's a great way to do it. And then also, how is the transfer portal and NIL going to be handled in the future? That's likely what most of the fans care about the most. I think that's something that a lot of people are pretty upset about right about now, and I think there's a number of reasons to be upset about it, and we'll find out what the solution for it is going forward. Obviously, contracts have been discussed, employment has been discussed, and likely that would involve players having to stick around for 2, 3, 4 years depending on the contract. So that'll be fascinating to watch. Definitely something that will define the sport. But on top of that, we have a little bit of conference realignment. It feels like we're never going to get rid of conference realignment, frankly, but Florida State, Clemson are out of the ACC. I feel pretty confident in that. Obviously, no paperwork has been signed. They're still going through that legal procedure, but the second they made those claims, the second they started arguing at the ACC, and Florida State changing their argument about 10 different times to make sure they can get out, I think that's all the indication we need of where they stand with the ACC. They want out, and they're going to find their way out. Utah might find their way in from the Big 12, which is a huge topic of conversation. In fact, the Utah just released a statement yesterday saying they are very happy in the Big 12. But I think, as we all know, you can say some things out loud, and then behind closed doors, you're doing some other things. So it'll be interesting to see that unfold. I think Utah is a huge domino in all of this because they are a huge program in college football, and they're someone that I think a lot of us were expecting to be the class of the Big 12 going forward. Well, maybe they're the class of the ACC going forward. So that'll be really interesting. And then, as we talked about earlier, the leadership. Who is going to be that person that's out in front of this sport? And it's kind of hard to figure out who it's going to be. Frankly, I know we're all pointing towards the SEC and the Big 10, and they have all of the power in the world. And it could be them. There's no doubt about that. It could just be an entirely new governing body instead of the NCAA. It could be them breaking off as their own entity and becoming a totally different thing. So the future of that is going to be very precarious. I think the two guys that probably have the most power over that, probably are the ones that I would circle the most to take over the sport, quote unquote, take over the sport, is Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti. They are the commissioners of the biggest conferences in the country. They are some of the most powerful people in the sport, and if something was going to happen with college athletics, like college football breaking off, or like the SEC and the Big Ten breaking off into their own entity, those are the two guys that would make it happen. So it'll be fascinating to watch this. I think there's so many things to love about this sport, and a lot of those things are not going away. I know it feels like the future of the sport is very uncertain and has pretty much no guarantees, but there's a couple of guarantees for the future of the sport, which is we're going to have football, and we're going to have some of the matchups that we all love. Obviously, conference realignment is a crazy thing, but we're still going to get Georgia-Florida for the foreseeable future. We're still going to get Georgia-Auburn. We're still going to get Texas-Oklahoma. We're still going to get Texas A&M. There's still those games. Ohio State, Michigan. All of these games are still alive, and the atmospheres in those stadiums are still alive. Jump around at halftime at Wisconsin, and Ralphie the Buffalo running out onto the field at Colorado. All of those things still exist, and I understand that there's a million different things going on around the sport that make it not as fun to talk about, not as fun to watch. All of those things I fully understand, and I agree with all of that sentiment, to be totally honest with you. I do agree that it makes it more frustrating. I do agree that most of this offseason, I wish that I was talking about football instead of talking about court cases and revenue sharing and everything in between. But we're at this point for a reason. And I think we got to this point because there was a long time in college football and college sports in general where these athletes were frankly being taken advantage of. And they were bringing in a lot of money for a school that was giving them essentially nothing back. I understand scholarships are great and all, but that is not the dollar amount that they are worth. I can promise you that. So this was all necessary. The house settlement, all of this stuff that is going on is something that probably needed to happen. Now, there could be a lot of things that happen in the future that don't need to happen, and we'll have to kind of take that we'll take that in stride and try to figure out what the best way forward is. But this is going to be the time that we all remember. This is going to be the time that we say college football was defined in the last, 20 years because of these couple of months, because of this next year. And we'll have to be careful about, who we choose to usher us into this new era. We'll have to be careful about the way that we go into this new era. But what I will say with absolute confidence, with no question, I can't say a lot of things with absolute confidence in this sport, but one thing I absolutely can is this sport is still going to be special. It's still going to have the parts of the sport that you love the most and the parts that you really care about the most, which is having your team on the field against a team that you hate for reasons that you don't fully understand, that go beyond you and beyond anything that you could possibly imagine. You're still going to have those atmospheres. You're still going to have the fans. You're still going to have all the stuff you love. So I'm just excited to get there. I'm excited to get to the place where everything just kind of sits for a second and we're in stable waters and we don't have to worry about all this stuff. But it's going to take time to get there. And there's going to have to be some things that happen that might not make you super happy to get there. And it's going to be a bumpy road, but I promise once we get on the other side, we're still going to have college football, and it's still going to be a beautiful sport, and it's still going to have probably 99% of the things that you love the most about it. So that's kind of my little testimony. I know that was a little bit long-winded and definitely something that I felt like just needed to be said at this point in time. So it's going to be a very interesting year. I'm going to be right there with you following everything, but I think we're going to be okay. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the Hall of Fame list for the college football. There is so many good names on this list that are newcomers to it, but also some of the past guys that honestly probably deserve to be in before this, but are still on that list. We'll break down everything that you need to know right after this, so stick with us.